I remember how my hands trembled as I set the plates on the table. The clink of porcelain in my fingers was louder than the laughter over dinner. They always laughed the same way, short, mocking, almost lazy. The words they threw behind my back felt like seasoning, easily digestible, meant to spice up their meal. I no longer reacted, no longer turned my head, no longer shrugged my shoulders or twitched my chin. I had learned to be quiet, like background noise, like air, like an unnoticed presence. But inside, something heavy and black was building up, like burnt oil left too long in a frying pan. At the table, they spoke about their lives as if I had never been a part of them. They talked about their achievements, their plans, the neighbors, even the weather. Anything to avoid meeting my eyes. And when they did, their gazes held a touch of disgust, a hint of pity, a flicker of mockery, as if I wasn't a daughter, not even family, but some unfortunate mistake that refused to disappear. When the laughter grew especially sharp, I knew. It was coming again. Another sentence delivered with a smirk, and it would fall on me like dirty rain. You'll never become anyone. In that moment, it was as if I ceased to exist. My bones lost their shape, my dreams erased like chalk from a blackboard. I didn't respond. I knew. Answers are for those who have a voice. All I had left was silence. They always said I was strange, that I had too many books, too few friends, that I didn't smile properly, didn't know how to enjoy music, didn't know how to be normal. They looked at me like a rough draft someone left on the table and forgot to finish. And I started to believe it. I crossed out my wants, tore pages from notebooks, hid the notebooks in the closet, hid myself, far from their eyes, from light, from reality. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. In the cracks of plaster, I searched for shapes, for meanings. Sometimes I imagined the cracks formed a map, as if somewhere beyond these walls there was a world where I might belong, where my thoughts wouldn't seem foolish, where my footsteps wouldn't sound misplaced. But I didn't know how to get there. I just kept staring. I did everything they asked, washed, ironed, cleaned, studied in silence. Each day blurred into the next, and I began to lose track of dates, of feelings, of myself. I felt like I had become a mirror, only reflecting their wishes, their words, their stares. There was barely any of me left in the reflection, just a faint silhouette, barely visible, barely alive. But at some point, quietly and imperceptibly, something in me began to shift. Not an explosion, not a rebellion, just a faint trembling under the skin. I stopped turning off the light at night. I let myself write in my notebook, hide the pages under my pillow, then take them out again. I started observing how they spoke, how they looked, how they moved, not out of fear, but curiosity. I began to piece them together like a puzzle, not to understand them, but to separate myself. So I would no longer be an extension of their thoughts. And then came the morning that changed everything. I remember the sound of footsteps in the hallway, steady, unfamiliar to our house. I remember how they fell silent, how they turned toward the door, and then he walked in, tall, stern, in uniform. His gaze swept across the room like a spotlight. Then it stopped on me, and he gave a small nod. And when he spoke those words, I didn't understand at first that he was talking about me. Time seemed to freeze, the air thickened. Then came a dull sound, their forks hitting the plates. I stood still as always. Only inside something broke, not with pain but with light. They stared at me as if I had just stepped out of a hallucination. Their mouths were slightly open, the silverware still spinning on the table like metal leaves caught in a silent storm. No one moved. No one blinked. For the first time in my life, they looked at me and didn't know who I was. Inside I was shaking, but not from fear. It was something else, something deeper, like the ground beneath my feet had stopped absorbing weight and now pushed back with steady force. My presence no longer felt like an accident. I stood there while their illusions crumbled in front of them, and for once, I let them fall. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The silence had changed its color. It was no longer the silence of shame or obedience. It was the silence of arrival, the kind that announces itself without sound, like the moment before a storm breaks or the instant just after a heartbeat stops. They couldn't look away, yet they couldn't look me in the eye either. They searched my face for something familiar, something to anchor themselves to the girl they used to diminish. but I had peeled off that version of me like old wallpaper. Underneath, there was someone else, someone they never imagined I could become. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were pressing in to compensate for the vastness of my change. Their chairs seemed too high for them, their pride too heavy. The man who had entered, crisp in uniform and calm in stature, hadn't come for them. He had come for me, and they knew it. The realization echoed around the table, louder than any words ever could. For years, they had carved their expectations into my skin, invisible cuts that shaped how I walked, how I breathed, how I thought of myself. I carried their voices with me like a second spine, one that bent under their doubts. But over time, I learned to stand on the fragments. I turned every insult into fuel, every eye roll into strategy, every dismissal into discipline. They thought they were breaking me. They were sharpening me. It hadn't been easy. The path I walked was narrow, quiet, and cold. It was paved with rejection and lit by resolve. There were nights I didn't sleep, days I doubted if I could survive one more moment without giving up. But something inside kept whispering, not loudly, never angrily, just insistently. A thread of will that refused to snap. I trained, I studied, I endured. I took every blow in silence and let it feed the furnace I built inside. I made plans. I followed them. I failed. I recalculated. I advanced. Step by step, word by word, breath by breath, and eventually, I earned more than respect. I earned rank. I earned purpose. I earned power. But most importantly, I earned my absence from their story. I no longer belonged to the narrative they had written for me, the one where I stayed small, where I bowed my head, where I disappeared quietly into the same mediocrity they wore like perfume. Now they looked at me and didn't recognize their own creation. Because I wasn't. I had rewritten myself, alone, in the silence of nights they never thought mattered. I had outgrown the mold they forced on me, and it terrified them. Not because I had changed, but because I had changed without their permission. As the man stepped aside and motioned toward the door, I didn't hesitate. My steps were slow but solid. Each movement was deliberate, as if I were walking not just away, but through them. Through the years of laughter and doubt, through the shadows of every evening they told me I wouldn't amount to anything. And when I reached the threshold, I didn't look back. They could sit there with their fallen forks and wounded pride. Let them gather their broken perceptions and whisper questions to each other they were too afraid to ask me. It didn't matter anymore. They had already said everything they would ever say. I had already heard every possible version of no, and now finally I was writing my own yes. 21 calls 8. The ride away from that house was quiet. The air outside felt too vast, too open after years of confinement in rooms where even silence had walls. I sat upright, hands still, eyes forward. The city passed by in streaks of gray and blue, unfamiliar yet strangely gentle. Every corner I turned was a step further from the version of myself I had outgrown. Every street lamp flickering in the early morning haze felt like a checkpoint I had crossed in some unmarked battle. No one asked me where I had come from. They already knew. They had read it in my posture, in the way I responded to commands not with eagerness but with calm inevitability. They could see the cracks that had healed into armor. There was no need for introductions. They didn't care about where I had been, only that I had made it. The days that followed were shaped by precision, duty, and silence. Not the silence of fear, but of focus. I found it comforting. There were no sharp glances, no whispered jabs, no laughter that turned warm rooms into cages, only structure, motion, goals. I wore my uniform like a second skin, not to hide, but to declare. This is who I became. This is what I chose again and again through every sleepless night and quiet defiance. But even there, among others who carried their own ghosts stitched into their sleeves, I often stood apart. Not by design, not out of pride, but from instinct. I had learned long ago that closeness invited hurt, that trust could be bait, that people who smiled could still aim to wound. So I remained distant, not cold, simply unreachable. I wasn't trying to protect myself anymore. I was preserving what I had built. I excelled, quietly, relentlessly. Every test was met without complaint. Every task completed without delay. I wasn't the fastest, the strongest, or the most naturally gifted, but I was immovable. When others fell, I stayed. When others doubted, I endured. I didn't need applause or recognition. I wasn't here to be seen. I was here to become undeniable. The name they gave me, my title, my rank, didn't feel real at first. It sat heavy on my shoulders, not like a crown, but like the proof of survival. I had carved each syllable with effort. I didn't wear it with vanity. I wore it like a scar, earned and permanent. It didn't erase the past, it gave it meaning. Sometimes I would hear that voice again, the same one that used to laugh at me behind teacups and wine glasses. I would remember the curve of their lips as they said I would never be anything. I would remember how easily they dismissed me, how casually they believed I had no future outside of the space they allotted me. And then I would remember the sound of silverware dropping. That moment, that single second when their certainty cracked, I carried it like a medal. Not for vengeance, not for triumph, but because it reminded me that transformation is never recognized by those who refuse to believe it possible. When I walked through corridors now, I felt my steps echo in rhythm with everything I had survived. People moved aside without hesitation, not out of fear, but out of respect, and in their eyes I no longer saw pity or contempt. I saw reflection, not of who I was, but of who I had become. Still, I never spoke about them. I never uttered their names. Not out of hate, but because they no longer deserved a place in the world I built. Let them remain in that dining room, frozen in time, staring at a girl they thought they understood. Let them replay that morning endlessly, trying to grasp how the quiet shadow at their table became a storm. I didn't need them to understand. Their understanding had never been the goal. Their approval had never been required, and now, with every step forward, I made sure of one thing: they could never follow. There were moments in the months that followed when I would catch my reflection and not recognize it. Not because it had changed beyond memory, but because I had never truly seen myself before. My eyes looked older, steadier, like they had learned to see through everything, through lies, through limits, through people who only knew how to shrink others. My back stayed straight, not out of pride, but out of necessity. I could no longer afford to fold. Sometimes I would dream of the house, not in nightmares, not in warmth, just in detail. The hallway where I had once tiptoed to avoid creaking the boards, the kitchen where laughter always had a knife underneath it, the dining table, polished to perfection, where I was served shame between courses. In the dreams, I would move through the rooms like a ghost. No one saw me, no one tried to stop me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't angry either. I was simply done. The dreams faded with time, replaced by other images, barracks, fields, weapons, the faces of those beside me in silence. We didn't speak of pain. We didn't speak of pasts. Everyone carried their own weight, their own shadows, but I saw it in their eyes, the same quiet grief, the same determination built from having once been underestimated. In that unspoken recognition, we became something like kin. I never looked for comfort. I didn't expect it. What I did search for relentlessly was clarity. I needed to understand what I had become. Not just the rank, not just the discipline, but the reason. I needed to know who I was when no one was watching, when no one could label me, deny me, or laugh at me. So I started waking before the others. I would sit alone under the morning sky, watching the dark shift into light. That hour belonged to no one, not to orders, not to voices from my past, just to me. In that space, I would take inventory, not of tasks or duties, but of strength. I would trace every scar, internal and invisible, and count them as currency. I was rich in survival. I was wealthy in will. One morning, I found myself standing in front of a mirror longer than usual. I looked at the insignia on my chest. The fabric was stiff, sharp at the edges, but I wore it with ease. And suddenly, I thought about the moment the man saluted me in front of them. I hadn't remembered it clearly until then, not the salute, but what it meant. It wasn't a performance. It was a verdict, a confirmation. And their silence in that moment wasn't shock. It was surrender. I would never know what they said to each other after I left. Maybe they rewrote their memories to soften their failure. Maybe they told others they had always believed in me. Maybe they stayed quiet, ashamed not of what they had said, but of having been wrong. None of it mattered. I had stopped needing answers from people who only ever gave me questions shaped like cages. Years passed quietly. Promotions came, responsibilities shifted, the uniform changed color, but I never let go of the stillness I had found in those early morning hours. No matter where I was stationed, I kept that one ritual, alone before dawn, silent, grounded, whole. I had learned that strength wasn't in declarations or displays, it was in consistency, in knowing who you are when the world refuses to tell you. And eventually, I realized something I hadn't known in the beginning. I hadn't become someone just to prove them wrong. I had become someone because I had always been her. Hidden, smothered, buried, but there. They just didn't want to see it, and now, they never would. Recognition came, but it never felt the way people think it does. There were ceremonies, photographs, handshakes. There were names spoken into microphones, medals pinned to fabric, applause that echoed in tall, echoing halls. I stood through it all with composure, unmoved by spectacle. It wasn't that I didn't feel anything. It was that I had already felt everything long before anyone thought to notice me. I didn't smile for the cameras. I didn't bask in attention. I had spent too long being invisible to be seduced by visibility. The world that once refused to believe in me was now eager to claim me. They printed stories, praised my resilience, shaped my past into something noble. They wanted me to be a symbol, something they could point to and say, "Look what perseverance can achieve." But I knew the truth they didn't. They hadn't seen the nights I cried into a pillow, biting my lip so no one would hear. They hadn't heard the silence after being told I was nothing, again and again, until the words tattooed themselves under my skin. They hadn't watched me walk out of that house with nothing but a straight spine and a decision. The world saw the result. Only I knew the cost. I let them talk, let them write, let them admire. But I kept my distance. I didn't owe anyone my story. I didn't owe them my scars. I had made a home inside my own quiet strength, and I refused to let anyone drag me back into needing to be understood. Still, there were moments when the past crept back in without permission, a laugh that sounded too much like theirs, a phrase spoken with the same tilt of contempt, a dinner table polished too brightly. Triggers buried deep, always waiting to bloom when least expected. But I didn't run from them. I let them come. I faced each one and stood still. I had nothing to fear from ghosts I'd already outlived. One evening, many years after I had last heard their voices, I received a letter. It came without warning, sealed in plain paper, the handwriting jagged and unsure. I recognized it instantly. My breath didn't hitch, my hands didn't tremble. I sat down, opened it, and read it in silence. They were older now. Time had softened their edges, maybe. Or maybe regret had sharpened them. The words were strange, meandering, uncertain, like someone searching for the right tone and never quite finding it. There was no apology, not directly, just a recounting of memories, and beneath it, a thread of something close to admission. They said they hadn't understood me, that they had been afraid, that they saw something in me they couldn't control and so they tried to erase it. They said they were proud now, that they watched every news piece, that they showed my picture to neighbors, that they told people stories they had once mocked. I read the letter once, then again. Then I folded it carefully and set it aside. It wasn't anger I felt. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was distance, deep and permanent. A knowing. I could finally see them for what they were. Not monsters, not villains, just small people who didn't know how to recognize something bigger than themselves. They weren't capable of seeing me then, and they didn't truly see me now. They only saw what the world told them I had become. But what I had become was never for them. I didn't write back, not out of cruelty, but because nothing needed to be said. The story was already over. They had their version and I had mine. Theirs was full of late pride. Mine was full of earned peace. The next day I went back to work as usual. Another briefing, another mission. I put on the uniform, tied my hair back, straightened my shoulders. But before I left my quarters, I glanced once at the folded letter on the desk. Then I turned off the light and walked out, leaving it in the dark behind me. There came a day when the silence returned, not as a void, but as a companion. It followed me into rooms, met me at doorways, walked beside me through corridors where my name no longer needed to be spoken. I had become the kind of person others instinctively stepped aside for, not out of fear, but from an unspoken recognition. I carried weight now, and it showed not in the medals I wore, but in how I stood when the world watched and when it didn't. With each new assignment, the distance between who I had been and who I was became harder to measure. It was no longer a simple before and after. It had become layers, strata of decisions, pain, grit, and control. I had buried the little girl they laughed at under so many hours of discipline that even I sometimes forgot her voice. But late at night, when everything else was quiet, I could still hear it. Not broken, not angry, just waiting. She wasn't something I wanted to erase. She was the first stone I had laid, the one that survived their words, their indifference, their cruel certainty. And I owed her the truth, that becoming someone didn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it felt like loss, like cutting ties to things you once begged to hold on to, like outgrowing even your own reflection. Leadership was a mantle no one truly prepared me for. They trained me for tactics, for logic, for pressure, but they never taught me how to carry the weight of other people's trust. It came silently, creeping into your bones. When I spoke, others listened. When I decided, others followed. Their eyes held expectation, belief. They didn't know the girl who had once counted the tiles on the kitchen floor to avoid looking up. I never let them see how heavy it felt. Still, I carried it. Not perfectly, not without flaw, but without hesitation. Somewhere along the way, I learned that power isn't in commanding others. It's in never being commanded by your past. That's what set me apart. I didn't climb the ladder to prove anything. I climbed it because staying where they left me was never an option. And now that I was here, I refused to pull it up behind me. I began mentoring others, quietly, selectively. Not the ones who demanded attention, but the ones who stayed silent in rooms too loud. I saw pieces of myself in them. Girls who stood at the edge of every circle. Young men who had been told to take up less space. I didn't offer them inspiration. I offered them honesty, no soft edges, no heroic illusions, just truth. That the world rarely applauds you when you're becoming, only when you've already arrived. One of them reminded me too much of who I had been. She never spoke unless spoken to. She kept her notes immaculate, her uniform cleaner than required. She disappeared in groups and reappeared in results. No one noticed her until I did. I watched her from a distance at first, not to test her, but to protect her. I had learned how dangerous visibility could be when you weren't ready. When she finally stood before me one afternoon with trembling hands and fire behind her eyes, I saw something break open. She was afraid of becoming what they said she would. I didn't comfort her. I gave her the same thing I had built my entire life on: space. I told her, without words, that she didn't need to rush, that becoming takes time, that survival, when done properly, can be the loudest form of defiance. And as she left, her shoulders slightly straighter, I felt something shift in me too. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just building a life, I was building a path, and others were starting to follow. The past no longer chased me. It had become a landmark, visible from a distance, but far enough behind to never threaten the road ahead. I walked on, always forward, never fast, but steady. Years don't pass with fanfare. They slip by silently, layering themselves into your memory until the old versions of you become distant figures behind glass. I had lived through seasons, through shifts in command, through places that blurred together in the back of my mind. Some faces stayed, most didn't. I had long stopped counting departures. People left, disappeared, got reassigned, or faded into stories. What remained was the shape of discipline, and the quiet certainty that I would endure whatever came next. There were promotions, briefings, directives. Every step forward deepened the solitude. The more I rose, the fewer people walked beside me. The air grew thinner at the top. It didn't scare me. I had lived most of my life on the edge of loneliness. I knew how to breathe in silence. But with the height came something else: reflection. Not the kind that brought tears or regret, the colder kind. The kind that forced you to admit how much of your life had been consumed by the climb. When you spend years proving you are not who they said you were, you can lose sight of who you actually are. I had become many things: respected, feared, admired. But sometimes, when the lights were off and the room quiet, I wondered if I had also become hollow. I didn't mourn the cost. I accepted it. Every sacrifice had been made deliberately. I had chosen this path with both hands. I had paid with time, with softness, with the parts of myself that didn't survive the fire. I didn't look for love. I didn't search for home. I had traded those things for clarity. And now I stood in the space I had carved, alone, but never small. There was a ceremony planned for me, another one. I had attended so many by then they blurred together. Polished speeches, stiff uniforms, cameras flashing, people would gather to say the words they always said. They would call me an example, a trailblazer, a testament. None of them knew the girl who once flinched at laughter. None of them would imagine the hands that once shook over dinner plates, gripping a fork like it was the last thing tethering her to this world. I let them plan. I let them dress the moment in formality. But I felt detached from it, as though they were celebrating someone I had built, not someone I was. The title they honored me for now had weight, legacy, reverence. But to me, it still felt like armor. Something I wore because I needed to survive, not because I sought to shine. The night before the event, I sat alone at my desk. The letter from years ago, still folded, still unopened since the day I left it in darkness, sat beside me. I hadn't touched it in all that time. But now, I reached for it. Not out of curiosity, out of closure. I unfolded it slowly, held the pages flat, and read it again. It hadn't changed. But I had. There were no apologies in it, only shadows of guilt, phrases that circled shame without naming it. They had tried to honor me in hindsight, tried to rewrite history now that the world had handed them proof that I had become someone. But what they never understood was that I hadn't become someone in spite of them. I had become someone far away from them. And that was not the same. I folded the letter again, and this time I didn't place it back on the desk. I tore it once, then again, into pieces too small to reassemble. I let them fall into the bin without ceremony, without anger. It wasn't an act of bitterness. It was a burial. They no longer lived in me, not their voices, not their doubts, not their laughter. I had finally outlived the version of myself they tried to create. The next morning, I stood before the mirror, buttoned the uniform, adjusted the collar, and looked at my reflection for a long time. I saw a woman no longer defined by what she overcame, but by what she had built in silence. And then I walked out to meet the applause, not because I needed it, but because I had earned the right to walk through it without bowing. The applause did not echo the way I expected. It filled the room, loud and bright, but it passed through me like wind through steel. I stood still under the lights, surrounded by polished wood and rows of eyes that looked at me with reverence, with awe, with a kind of distant familiarity. But none of them knew the storm that had built me. They saw only the calm that followed it. My name was spoken again and again, followed by titles, by years of service, by the milestones others used to define meaning. They listed the accomplishments, the campaigns, the numbers. I listened in silence, letting the rhythm of their praise move over me without sinking in. I was not ungrateful. I had simply grown used to carrying my worth without needing others to name it. I gave the speech they expected, sharp, controlled, measured. I thanked the necessary people, nodded at the right moments, ended on something strong and symmetrical. The room stood, they clapped, they smiled. But as I stepped down, returning to my seat, I felt a quiet ache. Not of sorrow, something else, something softer. I wasn't sad, I was simply full of years, of memory, of the long, silent climb that no one else had witnessed. That night, I didn't return to the officers' mess or the gathering. I walked the perimeter of the base alone, under stars that blinked without judgment. I kept my hands in my coat pockets and breathed in the cold until my lungs remembered something raw. It had been so long since I had done anything without expectation, so long since I had been allowed to simply be. I stopped near the wire fence and stared into the dark beyond it. Somewhere out there, the house still existed. Maybe they still lived in it. Maybe the table still stood where it always had, polished and self-important. I hadn't thought about it in months, years even. But now, I let the image rise again. I imagined the same room, the same laughter, the same certainty in their voices as they placed limitations like stones into my chest. I imagined the night they laughed when I told them what I wanted to become, how their amusement was sharper than rejection, how they thought they were protecting me from disappointment, never realizing they were feeding it to me instead. But now they couldn't reach me. Not through letters, not through time, not even through memory. I had built a life so far removed from theirs that they had become distant echoes, barely a trace on the edge of what I had made real. I turned back toward the buildings, the towers, the flag. I walked slowly, not out of weariness, but from a growing sense of finality. Not everything needed to continue. Some things deserved to end. I had spent years fueled by the need to prove, to climb, to build. But now that I had become unshakable, I understood that the last step wasn't another victory. It was peace. I entered my quarters and sat at the desk again. My uniform hung heavy on the chair's back. The light was dim, casting soft shadows across the clean floor. There were no awards on the walls, no framed articles, no reminders. I had never needed them. The world might keep records, but I had kept my truth, and that was enough. I reached for the notebook I rarely used. Not for reports, not for commands, for thoughts I couldn't speak aloud. I opened to a fresh page and wrote without pause. Not a letter, not a speech, not a confession, just a sentence, one I had waited years to write. I am no longer who they believed I was. I stared at the words, then closed the notebook gently. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten at the edges. Morning was approaching, the world preparing for another cycle, another march of time. But I wasn't racing anymore. I wasn't surviving. I was finally living. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in pale shades of silver and rose. I watched it through the narrow window, unmoving, letting the light inch across the floor until it touched the tips of my boots. I didn't rise, not yet. There was nowhere I needed to be this morning. No orders to issue, no objectives to secure. For the first time in a long time, I had given myself permission to be still. I had spent most of my life chasing distance, from them, from their words, from the version of myself they had tried to bury. And I had succeeded, more than anyone had expected, more than even I had once believed possible. I had become everything they said I could not. But now, here in the stillness after the climb, I faced something new. Not the past, not the fight, but the after. What do you do when the war within you ends? I didn't know yet. But I was ready to find out. I rose and changed, not into uniform, but into simplicity, clothes that fit without symbolism, fabric that spoke of no rank. I tied my hair back the same way I always had, not from habit but from clarity. Then I opened the drawer beside my bed and removed the only item I had kept from the past that still mattered. A photograph, faded at the edges. A younger me, before all the titles, before the silence hardened into armor. I looked at her and didn't feel shame. I didn't flinch. She was the first version of me who dared to want something more. Her hope had been fragile, but it had been enough to ignite everything that followed. I folded the photograph and slipped it into my pocket. Outside, the bass moved with quiet rhythm. People passed with nods, a few smiles, no questions. They had grown used to my presence. The way I carried myself had never invited approach. But that morning, something in me softened. I greeted them back, not with formality, with something closer to grace. I walked through the grounds slowly. My steps had always been deliberate, but now they held something else. Ease. I was no longer walking away from something. I was walking toward, not toward applause or rank or recognition, just toward the next unknown. And then I reached the edge of the compound, past the gates, past the last checkpoint. I paused there, looked out across the open road. There had been talk of retirement, of consulting, of teaching. People assumed I would transition into another form of structure, another version of duty. But I had decided on something else. I wasn't going to lead. I wasn't going to serve. I wasn't going to explain. I was simply going to live. No one knew what I would do next, and for once, neither did I. That thought didn't scare me. It felt like freedom. After years of fighting for space inside other people's expectations, I had created a life entirely on my terms. Now I would explore what that meant. Beyond orders, beyond mission, beyond performance. I stepped beyond the gate. The wind met me, not harsh but full, as if the world had been waiting. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. Let them sit at that table forever, remembering the moment when the world shifted and they could no longer contain me. Let their forks remain on the floor. Let their words rot in the past where they belonged. They had laughed at the idea of who I might become, and now they would spend the rest of their lives choking on the proof. But I wouldn't waste another second on them. I had already given them my silence, my pain, my fire. Now I was giving myself the rest. And with steady steps, I vanished into the morning. The end.